It was a crisp July morning in 2021 when 72-year-old Harold Miller set out for what should have been a routine hike in the Rocky Mountains. Harold wasn't just any elderly man, he was known around his Colorado town as the kind of person who thrived outdoors. His neighbors often saw him tightening the straps on his old hiking boots, maps tucked under his arm, and a smile that carried the confidence of someone who had spent decades in the wild. Age hadn't slowed him down, if anything, it made him more determined to prove he could still conquer the mountains. That morning, he told his daughter he'd be back by sundown, but by nightfall, his cabin remained dark and silent. Harold's car was later found parked neatly at the Pine Ridge trailhead, keys missing from the ignition, as though he had every intention of returning. Rangers noted something odd. Usually, Harold left a note, or at least told friends which path he planned to take. This time, there was nothing. No message, no map markings, no hints. It was unlike him. The only clue was a faint trail of boot prints leading into the woods, which abruptly vanished on a patch of hard, rocky ground. It was as if Harold had stepped off the earth itself. The search began the very next morning. Dozens of volunteers, search dogs, and even helicopters combed the area, calling his name into the dense forests and valleys. They expected to find a water bottle, a torn piece of clothing, or some indication that Harold had taken a wrong turn. But hours turned into days, and there was nothing. No campfire ash, no food wrappers, no broken branches. Every sign of human presence had simply evaporated. Search dogs, usually reliable, grew restless and refused to follow a consistent trail, whimpering as though something unseen lingered in the forest. Locals began to whisper about the North Hollow stretch of the trail. The area Harold was believed to have entered. Old-timers spoke of hikers who had gone missing there decades ago, with bodies never recovered. Some believed the area was cursed, while others suspected that Harold might have stumbled upon something, or someone, that didn't want him there. The silence of the woods weighed heavy on the search team, who couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on them from deep within the trees. After nearly 2 weeks, the official search was called off. Posters with Harold's smiling face were tacked to trees and gas station windows, his name broadcast on local radio stations. To his family, it was as though he had walked into the mountains and been swallowed whole. But to the rangers who had searched those woods, the unanswered question remained: how could a man as skilled as Harold Miller vanish without leaving a single trace behind? In the weeks following Harold's disappearance, the town at the foot of the Rockies began to buzz with whispers. At first, it was ordinary speculation. Maybe Harold had slipped on a ridge, maybe a bear attacked, maybe he wandered off trail and couldn't find his way back. But as the days stretched into weeks and no evidence surfaced, the conversation shifted. People began to say the same thing in hushed voices over coffee in diners, and in the corner booths of dim bars. Harold must have gone into the wrong part of the forest. That wrong part had a name locals avoided saying outright: North Hollow. To outsiders, it was just another piece of the mountain, overgrown and largely untouched. But to people who had lived near the Rockies for generations, it was a place of unease. Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter its tree line, and hikers told stories of sudden disorientation, as though the forest itself was rearranging paths behind them. Some swore they had seen flickers of movement in the shadows. Too tall for a deer, too silent for a bear. Harold, they believed, had wandered into North Hollow and never come back. There were older rumors too, ones that surfaced only after enough beers, or when a storm kept the power out. One tale spoke of a trapper in the late 1800s who vanished in that very stretch of forest, leaving behind only his rifle and a journal page scrawled with the words, "A follows at night." Another spoke of children in the 1960s who went exploring and returned home pale and mute, refusing to say what they had seen. These were just stories, of course, but stories that lingered for decades don't survive by accident. Rangers publicly dismissed all of it, chalking the silence and unease up to superstition. Yet even they couldn't ignore the fact that some parts of the search felt different. Radios had cut out inexplicably when teams entered North Hollow. Compass needles spun without reason. One ranger later admitted, off the record, that he'd felt something was wrong, like they weren't alone out there. It was too quiet, he said. Even the birds wouldn't sing. By the end of that summer, the rumors had cemented themselves into the town's folklore. Harold Miller wasn't just another missing hiker anymore. He had become part of the legend of North Hollow. And while some insisted he was simply another victim of bad luck in the wilderness, others were convinced of something darker. That Harold hadn't just disappeared, he had stumbled onto something hidden in those woods, something that wanted him gone. By the end of that first brutal summer, Harold Miller's name had slipped from the nightly news. What began as front-page headlines elderly hiker missing in Rockies, soon became just another file in the sheriff's office. Search and rescue teams had done their part, exhausting every hour and resource, but when autumn rolled in, the official investigation was quietly shut down. The Rocky Mountains had claimed many lives over the decades, and to most officials, Harold was simply another statistic. A missing hiker stamp was placed on his file, and the world moved on. But not everyone forgot. Harold's daughter kept his cabin exactly as he had left it, boots by the door and his favorite jacket hanging on the rack. Friends would occasionally stop by, convinced that somehow Harold might stroll back into town, carrying a story about how he had been lost but survived. Weeks turned to months, and hope began to wither. What unsettled people most was not just the lack of answers, it was the lack of anything at all. Not a scrap of clothing, not a snapped twig that could be verified, not even bones for closure. The mountains had swallowed him whole, leaving behind silence. Among the ranger community, Harold's case stuck out like a sore thumb. Rangers were used to closing files on hikers who had fallen, gotten lost, or succumbed to the elements, but in most of those cases, some trace always turned up eventually: equipment, remains, or at least a sign of distress. With Harold, there was none of that. In fact, several of the rangers privately admitted that the search for Harold had been unlike any other they'd conducted. As if they had been searching in the wrong place all along, even though they were exactly where he should have been. Over time, Harold's case took on a strange dual life. To officials, it was a closed matter, unfortunate, but nothing unusual in the vast wilderness. But to locals and even some within the ranger service, the case had become a cold reminder that the forest didn't just take people. It sometimes erased them. A few younger rangers began referring to Harold's disappearance as the hollow vanish, a phrase that carried with it the chilling implication that the woods themselves had a hand in it. Though it was never spoken of publicly, it became an unshakable part of ranger lore. By the time the 2-year mark passed, Harold's face was gone from posters, his name faded from town gossip, but his absence remained heavy. Every time a ranger hiked past the Pine Ridge trailhead and saw the empty gravel spot where his car had once been parked, they felt it. That invisible weight of an unsolved mystery. Harold Miller wasn't just gone, he had been wiped clean from the mountains, leaving behind only unanswered questions that no one dared to ask out loud. 2 years after Harold Miller's disappearance, the Pine Ridge Trail had grown quiet. The once busy search paths were now overrun with weeds, branches sagged heavy with moss, and the forest seemed to have sealed itself shut, as if trying to erase the memory of what happened there. Hikers still came to the Rockies, but most avoided North Hollow, the part of the forest where Harold was last believed to have gone. It was late autumn of 2023 when a new team of rangers, rotated in from out of state, was assigned to patrol the lesser used trails and make sure the area was safe before the heavy snow came. The group consisted of 3 rangers, each with years of wilderness experience, but none had been part of Harold's original search. They had only heard whispers about the old man who vanished, and figured it was just another local legend. That changed when one of them, walking slightly ahead of the group, felt his boot catch on something beneath a bed of fallen leaves. At first, he thought it was just a root, but when he brushed the leaves aside, he froze. A rusted wire snare, taut and still functional, was anchored to a tree trunk. It wasn't random debris, it was a trap. The rangers crouched low, carefully inspecting the device. It wasn't crude. Whoever had built it had known exactly what they were doing. The tension, the placement, the concealment, it was all deliberate, designed to wound, maybe even kill. The discovery unsettled them, but what rattled them more was the realization that no hunter had reported anything like this in the area for years. And if one trap was here, there were probably more. Suddenly, the woods around them didn't feel like wilderness anymore. They felt like enemy territory. As they moved cautiously forward, they began to find others. A log balanced with sharpened stakes hidden beneath pine needles. A rope stretched across a narrow path, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Each one was deadly, each one fresh enough to suggest it hadn't been sitting there for decades. The forest, once silent and empty, now seemed to hum with menace. None of them said it aloud, but all 3 had the same thought: who built these and why here? When they reached a small clearing, the answer didn't come. But a new question did. In the middle of the clearing was something caught on a jagged branch, a strip of faded, weather-beaten fabric. The color was muted, but one ranger recognized it instantly from the old case files. Harold Miller's jacket. 2 years of silence, and suddenly, the forest was speaking again. Only now, what it was saying was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The strip of fabric hanging from the branch wasn't just random cloth. When one ranger carefully removed it, and held it up to the fading daylight, The weight of recognition hit all of them. It matched the jacket Harold Miller was last reported to be wearing the day he vanished. The material was torn and frayed at the edges, as if it had been ripped off during a struggle. Or perhaps snagged as he moved through the dense underbrush. But what unsettled them most wasn't just the discovery itself. It was the fact that the fabric looked too well preserved for something that had supposedly been out in the elements for over 2 years. It was as though it hadn't been lying in the dirt all that time, but rather, kept somewhere, and placed here. With that chilling thought lingering in the air, the Rangers widened their search of the clearing. The traps they had already encountered now seemed to form a perimeter, as if the entire area had been deliberately fortified. One ranger described it later as, walking into the middle of a cage, only we didn't know who it was built to keep out, or keep in. The silence of the forest pressed heavily around them. Not even the rustle of a squirrel, or the flap of a bird's wing could be heard. It felt staged, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then came another discovery, hidden beneath a rotting log near the clearing's edge. A shallow pit had been dug, covered with branches and leaves. When the Rangers uncovered it, they expected to find animal bones or discarded tools. Instead, they found something human, a rusted tin box, wrapped carefully in plastic sheeting. The box wasn't buried deep. It was concealed just enough to avoid casual detection, almost as if whoever had hidden it wanted it to be found eventually. The Rangers hesitated before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside could change the entire understanding of Harold's disappearance. Inside the tin, alongside scraps of water, damaged paper and a few rotted matches, was something they hadn't expected. A small, weather-worn journal. Its pages were swollen from damp, and much of the writing was smudged and illegible. But a few sentences stood out, scratched into the paper with a shaky hand. One line, in particular, stopped the Rangers cold. If anyone finds this, he's still here. He doesn't want me to leave. I hear him at night. Please, don't come looking for me. And at the bottom, faded but clear enough, was a signature Harold M. The clearing suddenly didn't feel abandoned anymore. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, every tree seemed to loom closer. One ranger swore he heard a faint rustling in the undergrowth, though when they spun around with flashlights, nothing moved. The discovery of the traps, the fabric, and now the journal raised a horrifying possibility. Harold Miller hadn't just vanished into the wilderness. He may have stumbled into something, or someone, that wanted the forest to remain untouched. And if Harold's final words were true, whatever it was might still be there. The journal, though fragile and water-damaged, became the Rangers' most important find. They sat in a tight circle as the daylight drained from the trees, each of them straining to read the faint words scribbled across the pages. The handwriting was jagged, inconsistent, sometimes frantic, sometimes faded, as if written in moments of panic or exhaustion. Most of the entries were short, fragmented notes, but they painted a picture more disturbing than anything they had prepared themselves for. This wasn't just a record of survival, it was a record of fear. The earliest legible entry dated back to July 2021, only days after Harold had first disappeared. In it, Harold mentioned setting up a temporary camp, waiting for searchers to pass nearby. He wrote about hearing helicopters overhead, calling out until his throat was raw, but receiving no response. Strangely, he claimed that when he followed the sound of voices in the forest, they would always drift further away, leading him deeper into the trees, until he no longer recognized where he was. It's like the woods are folding in on themselves. He scrawled. I can't get out. Later entries took a darker turn. Harold described hearing footsteps at night, not animal footsteps, but measured, deliberate pacing just beyond the glow of his campfire. He never saw anyone, but the sound returned night after night. At one point, he wrote, he doesn't sleep. He waits. When I move, he moves. When I stop, he stops. The way Harold referred to this figure, never by name, only as he, suggested that whoever it was had become a constant presence, something Harold felt certain was following him, studying him. Midway through the journal, Harold's notes grew more erratic. He began describing the discovery of traps in the forest, the same kind the Rangers themselves had now found. According to Harold, some of them were freshly laid, others rusted and old, as though they had been sitting in the woods for decades. He speculated whether these traps were meant for animals, or for people. They're everywhere. One entry read, I think they're meant to herd me, push me where he wants me to go. I can't tell anymore if I'm walking on my own, or if I'm being guided. The final pages were the hardest to read, smeared with water damage, and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. But one passage stood out clearly, scratched deep into the paper with pressure that nearly tore through the page. If anyone finds this, don't follow the trail. Don't answer when he calls. He doesn't let you leave. He doesn't want anyone to know he's here. After that, the handwriting stopped abruptly, as though Harold had been interrupted mid-thought. The Rangers stared at the closing lines in silence, each of them realizing the same thing. Harold Miller may have left them his voice on the page, but he had left no trace of himself. And worse, according to his words, whatever haunted him in those woods might still be waiting. Despite the discovery of Harold's journal, no body was ever recovered. Rangers searched the clearing and the surrounding forest for weeks after, combing every inch for remains, clothing, or tools that might offer closure. But each search ended the same way, empty-handed. The traps were dismantled and removed, the fabric and journal catalogued as evidence, but the forest itself gave nothing back. It was as though Harold Miller had been swallowed by the mountains, and only spat out fragments, enough to deepen the mystery, but never enough to solve it. The Ranger Service quietly shut down public access to North Hollow, citing hazardous terrain and wildlife dangers. But off the record, whispers circulated among the staff. Some claimed the traps were too carefully arranged, too methodical, to have been the work of a single elderly hiker losing his mind. Others believed Harold had stumbled into someone else's hidden territory, perhaps an outlaw, a hermit, or worse, someone who wanted the woods to remain untouched. What unsettled them most was Harold's words, "He doesn't let you leave." That sounded less like paranoia and more like a warning. Hunters who ventured too close to the restricted area began reporting eerie experiences. Some spoke of hearing footsteps that matched their own, echoing just far enough away to stay unseen. Others described glimpses of movement in the treeline, too quick, too tall, too deliberate to be an animal. One group swore they found a fresh trap reset only days after rangers had cleared the area. The forest, it seemed, was resisting their efforts to strip it bare. Whatever was building those snares wasn't gone. The story of Harold Miller soon spread beyond the small Colorado town. Online forums dedicated to strange disappearances lit up with theories. Some argued he had been captured by a recluse living deep in the Rockies. Others suggested the presence of something far older, something that had always been there waiting. Skeptics dismissed it all as wild speculation, but even they struggled to explain the traps, the journal, and the chilling consistency of the stories told by those who had wandered too close. To this day, the Rocky Mountains remain dotted with warnings and closed-off trails, and North Hollow sits silent behind no entry signs. Yet silence doesn't mean safety. On quiet nights, hunters and campers claim to hear faint cries carried on the wind, pleading, desperate, almost human. Some say it's just the wind curling through the valleys. Others insist it's something else entirely. And for those who remember Harold Miller, the question remains, if he wasn't alone in those woods, then who, or what, is still out there? So what really happened to Harold Miller in the Rockies? Did he stumble into the territory of a dangerous recluse, or did he uncover something far more sinister, something that has been lurking in North Hollow for generations? The truth may never be known. What we have are traps that shouldn't exist, journal pages that warn of a presence no one has ever seen, and a silence in the forest that feels unnatural. Harold's body has never been found, but his words remain. He doesn't let you leave. And so the Rockies keep their secrets, the same way they always have. Maybe one day, another hiker will vanish and leave behind more answers, or maybe, like Harold, they'll only leave behind more questions. Until then, North Hollow waits, and whatever's out there, waits with it.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.